Hey gang, we got some voting rights coming at you. I'm not going to record the voter turnout slides. There were only a couple of them, and most of them I was having you guys do research. You're going to be accountable for them. They will be likely to show up on the midterms, so don't just not do that. But it's not really worth recording because there's not a lot to talk about in slides. So as you have questions, write them down, and we'll talk more when I see you in class next. But here we go. So starting off with an old political cartoon, take a moment and make some observations, and then think of a title for the cartoon and how it might relate to some of what we'll be talking about. All right, so couple of parts here. First off, we get the 15th Amendment is important to note. It's one of the post-Civil War or Civil War amendments. It grants African Americans the right to vote, but the thing is, people were still finding ways to prevent African Americans from voting, and so there would be things like poll taxes, where you'd have to pay a tax in order to vote. There might be a literacy test where you'd be asked to do some ridiculous reading and or writing test in order to vote. But then there were clauses like the grandfather clause. They're kind of known as grandfather clauses that would make it so that certain groups didn't have to take those tests. And as you're probably guessing, those groups were white people that could prove that they were eligible to vote. They wouldn't, prior to a certain date, usually, around 1865. Don't know why that's the date they chose. Hopefully you're picking up the sarcasm. But grandfather clauses would make it so that whites would still be able to vote and wouldn't be subject to the same restrictions. And a good case to look at is Gwynn versus the United States. This strikes down the grandfather clause in I believe it was Oklahoma was using some restrictive rules, and the Supreme Court finally said enough is enough. Another interesting case or another interesting question is, does the 15th Amendment apply to primary elections? In Smith-Allwright, the Supreme Court said, it does. Voting is voting. It's not just voting for the president. You need to be part of the whole thing. And then we have the 24th Amendment as another important one, because this constitutionally ends the poll tax. A tax that people would pay in order to vote, and voting that's going to limit who can vote, and therefore make it so that we're not getting a good spread or a good representation of the country. Another important act to note is the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Definitely look into that a bit more. It is very significant in ending the disenfranchisement. With the 24th Amendment ends poll tax, but then we get kind of an end to literacy tests, and kind of eliminates the grandfather clause as well. So the Voting Rights Act is extremely significant in the civil rights movement and in promoting equality among voting practice. So consider how those amendments and laws we just looked at, even the court cases, are going to impact federalism. Think back to that balance of power between state and federal governments, and a lot of these are shifting power in favor of the federal government because states weren't doing their part. They weren't treating people equally. They weren't treating people fairly, and so the federal government needed to step in order to ensure that the people's rights were being respected. And the 14th Amendment is huge in allowing and giving the national government or the federal government that power. And so if I was you, I would take a second, reflect, maybe do an idea about one of those or a couple of the laws and amendments you looked at on the last slide. Moving on. Another mini assignment, maybe pause this for a moment, go to OIAS, and check out the Brown versus the Board of Education, one of the biggest court cases in the civil rights movement. As you look at it, don't just look at the facts of the case, or don't just look at the outcome. Consider what is the actual question being asked in Brown versus the Board of Education. Then look at the outcome. Were there dissenting opinions, or was it unanimous? And what does that tell you about the way the Supreme Court felt about the decision? Brown v. Board is huge, and it's something you're going to need to know for class, for life, for the test, you name it. So make sure you look into that. And as you have questions, write them down, bring them to class, and we'll talk about them more. So kind of continuing with minority groups, the Voting Rights Act applies to all groups. It's not just African Americans. And so if you are Hispanic, if you are Asian, if you are any minority group, the Voting Rights Act applies to. You are not allowed to have your voting rights taken away based on your race. NARF is the Native American Rights Fund, a group that fights and advocates for Native Americans. Hispanics are known as kind of the sleeping giant. There are a huge percentage of Hispanics in the United States, and they don't tend to show up to vote. And so as they start to develop that sense of efficacy, there will be shifts in the political culture and in the makeup of Congress. And so as American politics becomes more ingrained, that's a change that we will likely see here in the next, hopefully sooner than later, but in the next 5 and 10 and 20 years will be the role Hispanics play in American politics. Asian Americans are considered the most rapidly growing and often hailed as the most successful group, a minority group in the United States. Especially when we look at most successful, I know there were a lot of discriminatory practices against Asians throughout the years, whether it was the Chinese in the 19th century or the Japanese in the mid to early 20th century, or the Vietnamese in the latter part of the 20th century. There's been a lot of discrimination against Asians, and they've continually overcome that. And if you look at the jobs and the professions that they do, they tend to be very highly educated and hold good jobs with high degrees, high paying jobs, and so they are frequently considered the most successful. Korematsu is an interesting case. You probably have heard of this if you paid attention in U.S. history, but this was an example of when that word unless in the writs of habeas corpus came into play. The government can't suspend your writs of habeas corpus unless public safety deems it necessary. And during World War II, we round up Japanese Americans and put them in internment camps, and this was a lawsuit that came out of that. Moving on. Women. We could go on and on about women, right, fellas? But we're going to stick to the voting rights. The 19th Amendment grants women the right to vote. Interestingly enough, there was an Equal Rights Amendment that was intended to enforce full equality for women, and it actually passed through Congress. It got the 2/3 vote it needed in Congress, and then when it went to the states, it never got the 3/4 that it needed at the state level. And so it is not a current amendment, but it was something discussed long ago, and it never fully got there. Some more cases to kind of help drive the point home. You've got Reed versus Reed and Craig versus Boren. And Reed, there was a law in Ohio that made men the mandatory administrators of an estate, meaning that if somebody died, the man automatically received the inheritance, and there didn't, in the absence of a will, I should say, the man automatically would receive that. And this was a clear violation of the 14th Amendment. Equal protection is not being offered to all people. And in a unanimous decision, the court said, this was not okay. Craig versus Boren is an interesting one. This one was, I can't remember what state this was, but the state law said that guys had to be 21 in order to buy beer from the liquor store. Girls only had to be 18. and they sued and won. Equal protection is not just protecting females; it is also intended to protect males. It's intended to protect all people, and ensure that the rights of all people are protected. So there's lots and lots and lots. The list is very long. In '86, courts established that women could sue employers for sexual harassment, and that the Civil Rights Act permitted that. We also have the Title IX, which forbids discrimination based on gender. Excuse me. Which forbids discrimination based on gender for any federally subsidized education program. So, you think athletics, that's where Title IX is coming into play. You kind of have to have equal sports, or equal opportunities, really. You can't, it's discriminatory to have more opportunities for males to participate than it is for females, and so that it's required that is legal. I always think about Twisted Sister when I think of the 26th Amendment. A bunch of people just not parading, but marching in the streets. We're not gonna take it. And that's really what it is the young people were sick of it and they weren't going to take it anymore. The 26th Amendment lowers the voting age from 21 to 18, and you'll see that poster on the left there. That's an actual poster from the campaign to lower the voting age, and it actually originated in World War II. I think a lot of us think of it as a Vietnam era campaign, and it really intensifies during Vietnam. But it does have its roots in World War II, because during World War II you could be 18 and you could be drafted into the military, and we like to think that was a time when everybody picked up the flag, so to speak, and went and fought for the country. But not everybody favored World War II. It wasn't, it definitely gets idolized in American culture. And so it takes its roots in that, but then again, it intensifies during Nam. And, the slogan that you would hear people chanting, old enough to fight, old enough to vote, because they felt if they were going to be drafted and sent to fight and possibly die in another country, that they should have the right to choose the people sending them overseas. Then we have the National Voter Registration Act. This was passed in 1993. It's most often referred to as the Motor Voter Act. No both, but to be 100% honest, I've only ever seen it referred to as the Motor Voter Act. And basically it's to increase registration opportunities. And so, like, when you get your driver's license, you can register to vote. I know when I switched over and got my Colorado driver's license, I was able to check a box, and that registered me to vote here in the state of Colorado. So it makes it a lot easier. It increases the likelihood that somebody is going to register. It also allows for mail-in registration, and then it also addresses some disability concerns and ensures that people with disabilities will have the opportunity to vote too. So take a minute and look at the graph. Was the law effective? We've got the adult population in green. You've got registered voters in, burgundy. And that blue color is actual voter turnout. Was it effective? Did it get people registered? And then did it actually increase voter turnout? And that's, so take a minute, identify that, describe it based on the graph. So the American people, and a census of the American people is taken every 10 years. That's constitutional. And the point of that is to apportion seats in the House properly. And that also dictates where electors will go. And so as people move, representation is going to change. As jobs leave some states and go to other states, people are going to move from states. As populations get older, people are going to move to certain states. And so it also it makes it so that states can have adequate and proper representation